and has an ebook out called How to Be a Liberal. And Juliet Samuel is a Daily Telegraph columnist. They're here to answer your questions. The lines are open now, 0345 6060 973. And you can, of course, watch us on Global Player, on the LBC website at lbc.co.uk, or the LBC YouTube, Facebook and Twitter feeds.
0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Let's go to our first caller. It's Simon in Chelsea. Good evening, Simon. What's your question, please?
My question is, do we think it's acceptable for somebody to do the amount and the bigger sort of data breach that we've had, for somebody not to take any responsibility or accept or take any blame with regarding these people that have stood with us shoulder to shoulder and have gone through probably one of the worst things, and now they've had their sort of, information displayed across the world in various other, various things.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's just give the detail of this. So, as an email that was sent from the Ministry of Defence to 250 Afghan interpreters, and instead of blind copying everybody, it was put in the copy category in an email. It is, I have to say, easily done. We've probably all done it around this table. That is no excuse for it. It should not have happened. You say nobody's taken responsibility for it, Simon. Well, Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, he went to the House of Commons literally within hours of it happening. But maybe you think he should have done more. Let's go to our panel. Now, Clive, you used to be Shadow Defence Secretary, also served in the Armed Forces. What do you make of this?
I think the reason I think this rankles so much with people is because I think if we had stood by Afghan interpreters in particular, and these are the people we're talking about, if we had stood by those people who were seeking refuge here in this country, especially those interpreters who served with British forces in Afghanistan, I think most of your listeners, whatever they think about immigration policy, will say, well, hold on a second, these guys, and I know, I was on the front line with them, I served with them, I walked with them, they face the same dangers, the same hardships, they face the same rounds, the same IEDs, improvised explosive devices. These guys put their life on the line, and they gave us more than just translations. They gave us the context of what we were doing. They gave meaning to the surroundings in which we were in. And so for them to be treated so shoddily, and I think the way I see this, and I'm going to politicise this, a lot of people think, hostile environment, it's just one of those things that the government have now gone past. Windrush happens, stop banging on about it. But hostile environment has never gone away. And I think what you can see here is this is the reality of a hostile environment. This is what it looks like. It's not an abstract. This is what hostile environment looks like in reality. It doesn't discern whether you're deserving or not, or it doesn't make any kind of condition on that. It just basically says, you're from abroad, you don't deserve to be in this country, go away. We don't care whether you rot in a refugee camp, whether we push you back across the English Channel, or whether you serve this country, put your life on the limb, and need to come here. Hostile environment says you're all going away. And that's the reality of hostile environment. And I think for the first time, many people can see that reality. And I think that's why this leak, I understand we all make mistakes, clearly, we do, and we've all done it. But I think that's why this mistake rankles so much with people, and why so many people, I think, have been offended at the treatment of those interpreters and many others.
Iain Dunt, Ben Wallace in the Commons today said when he heard about this, he was incredibly angry. The buck does stop with him. He's the Secretary of State, but this will have been presumably a junior civil servant that pressed the wrong button, and yet the politician has to take the rap for it. Is that right?
Well, yeah, but someone's got to take the rap for it, and also it's a further demonstration of institutional failure throughout this thing. We saw the same thing in the embassy in Afghanistan, with names being left there for the Taliban to find. Over and over, we've failed in our duty of protection here. When you look at ARAP, this is the scheme that's supposed to help those who help the British government in Afghanistan. so they can come to the UK and be kept safe here. Now, that scheme was not delivered for everyone who helped Britain. It was only delivered to those who were directly employed by the British government. Those working for third-party companies, including many interpreters, were excluded from that scheme. There were months where the British government was told, you need to fix this. And if you do not fix it, these people will be left behind. We will fail to evacuate them. We will fail to keep them safe. Yet the British government did not fix it. It was still asking for papers of people at the airport. Now, that was not done in other countries. The US shipped people off to a third country. It did the paperwork on the back end. It made sure the bureaucracy did not get in the way of the evacuation. That is not the way the British government did. So this looks like another instance of them failing on the very basic things you need to do to keep people safe, and then failing also in terms of policy of keeping people safe.
Juliet Samuel.
Well, I think that it speaks to the total chaos that surrounded the whole evacuation of Afghanistan, and the fact that our government seemed to have done shockingly little to prepare for what was always a possibility, that they would have to effectively get their people out in a huge hurry. And I think that maybe the government thought that this isn't going to matter, as Joe Biden seems to have thought. Well, no one's going to care about people in a foreign country very far away. But actually, I think people do have a real sense of duty and of feeling ashamed of their country for letting people down, for demanding so much of people, or effectively luring them into a position where they're helping our country and then just hanging them out to dry at the end of it.
Ben Bradley, it looks as if it's sort of one failure after another with regard to the last few weeks in the Afghanistan policy. I mean, sometimes you hear these incidents and, OK, we can all say, well, we've done it ourselves and blind copied someone in, but it's just one thing after another.
Well, that particular incident, it's clearly an individual cock-up, isn't it? I'm always inclined to believe things are cock-up rather than conspiracy when it comes to governments of any colour, to be honest. And certainly is the case with this, and Ben Wallace admitted that himself in Westminster today, didn't he? So from the caller's point, I don't think it's the case that nobody's taking responsibility for it. I think he was pretty upfront, came to the chamber and he took responsibility, even though actually it wasn't his cock-up. As you say, it's his job at the end of the day. But look, there's always this assumption, we want to do the right thing. We've been left in a position by this withdrawal where we didn't have as much notice as we wanted. We didn't have as much time as we wanted. And it's an incredibly chaotic environment. And Clive's absolutely right about wanting to support people, about the incredible efforts that people went to support British troops, about our duty to help as many people as we possibly can. But it's not like you can just wander down the road with a list of names, drag people out of their registered address and walk them to the airport, is it? It's incredibly difficult and challenging an environment. We don't control the main airport anymore. We've got, I think the Dominic Raab was saying there's 250,000 inquiries gone into the Foreign Office looking to find people or help to relocate people. So both the bureaucracy on this end of organising that, and then the practicalities of going and finding people in what is you want to talk hostile environments, right? That's the hostile environment where we're going to send our troops in to go and find these guys. We owe it to them to try and do that. But to suggest that it's a simple thing that we could have just done better is kind of missing the real point and challenge of that, I think.
Before the evacuation, right? I mean...
2013 they've been applying.
We've got thousands of people out since 2013. I think we're up to nearly 9,000 people now.
But there were a lot of people a lot of interpreters particularly, who had applied to come, and their cases just weren't being dealt with before all this happened. Clive, you're the only Clive and Ben, you're the only MPs on the panel. Last night, John McDonnell was telling me that maybe his constituency's different from yours, but he has 800 constituency cases related to Afghanistan. Layla Moran was saying she had 400. Have you got any sort of anywhere near those figures, both of you?
I don't have near those figures, but I do have a substantial amount of people who have either family or kith and kin who are in Afghanistan, who are trying to get them out. And, the difficulty that we had during the height of the crisis, from even getting a basic response from the Foreign Office, I think it's well documented about just how bad and how stressful it was for people, literally, terrified of, we saw how terrified people were. They were hanging on to planes taking off from the airport. I mean, I don't know how scared you have to be to kind of take your chances with a plane taking off and hanging on to it on the outside. But I'm going to go a stage further and just say that, the British government over a long period does have form on this. I'm going to be controversial. I'm going to say, you can look at Gurkhas and their pension rights. You can look at Samoans. You can look at Sikhs in the First World War who were denied any kind of help or support for PTSD and shell shock compared to their British counterparts. You can look at Africans who fought for the British, who were buried in mass graves in the First World War. You can look at also our own British veterans from Afghanistan and Iraq, people who are homeless, who can't get mental health support through their local authority, through the local health authority, people who have served this country in various guises. There is a track record of this, of the British state letting down those who have served for them. And I think it's something we need to be aware of. The British state does not have a good track record on this over quite a long period. So I know we're shocked and surprised. Some people are shocked and surprised by this. But if you take a longer view, a longer historical view, there's a very well known amongst soldiers. It's well known that the British Army will look after its officers, but less so its soldiers. That's a common concept in the army. And I think this isn't something we should see in isolation. This is a longer term issue. And I think it speaks both to an intersectional analysis of both race and class, of how the British state views these people in many ways as expendable. And I think there is a hierarchy. And I think you can see that very clearly in what happened in Afghanistan.
And you look at the pitiful budget that the Veterans Affairs Department within the MOD has. It was set up as it was a new department, but the budget that it has, Johnny Mercer's obviously been talking about this. Why is it that we don't treat veterans with the respect that they deserve, Ben?
Well, I don't agree with Clive that it's some kind of institutional, lack of willing to do that. I think, we can all argue about money, everything needs more money, and you can make that case for a lot of things. There's only a finite amount of that. But, certainly from my perspective, it's not just a national issue, is it? I'm the leader of a council. We're off the back of this Afghan kind of crisis, the amount of support that we've stepped up to add additional mental health support, signposting, support for our armed forces community. My constituency, off the back of that conversation with Clive there, is 99.4% kind of white British. We don't have an Afghan community from that point of view. What we do have is an awful lot of veterans. It's one of those kind of patriotic kind of communities that values service, and I would very much dispute the fact that people don't see the value in that or don't want to support our armed forces.
I don't think I was saying that.
He said the government
Well, it goes back to what he said at the beginning about the hostile environment and not seeing the difference, I think, between, foreign is just foreign and when it's not welcome. I don't think that's true at all. I think when you get into this kind of conversation, the vast majority of my constituents, despite, the stereotypes, 79% leave, anti-immigration kind of conversation that always floats around it, very much welcome and recognise our duty to these people that have supported us and served us. The challenge, I think, is in the context of an immigration system and small boats and everything else that goes on the other side that makes it look very chaotic and very difficult. But if we can get a handle on that, this is an isolated incident. I think people are very supportive of bringing people over here.
The trouble is that the hostile environment is the only basis upon which the Home Office operates. So now that we've brought people over from Afghanistan to the UK, we've chucked them in hotels. They've been left without baby food for their children, without medical help for young pregnant mothers. Now, I don't even think at the moment that the Home Office wants to be doing that. It's just that all the Home Office understands how to do is to create a hostile environment. So then when it starts with Operation Warm Welcome, it doesn't know how to do it. It doesn't have the institutional memory to do it. It doesn't have the function to do it. All it knows is the hostile environment.
Science, shouldn't. I mean, if the five of us got together to create an Operation Welcome for Afghans coming into this country, we could probably do it quite well. Why is it beyond the ken of the Home Office to do that?
We don't have to deal with the practicalities of actually delivering that for thousands and thousands of people arriving on planes in the middle of the night.
But that wasn't that hard. I mean, they were failing to communicate with local councils or local charity groups about not just where they were, but how many people there were. These were the lucky ones, the ones that we said we were going to keep safe on a basic informational basis. The Home Office instantly failed on the first day. Well,
it's like the letters that were sent to European nationals who had a right to live here, and they were told that they had to go home and they were illegally in this country, when in fact, they maybe they'd got something wrong on their 80-page form or something like that. Does seem to be a disconnect, a sort of computer says no mentality that's just applied broadly across all situations.
Can I just say, Ian? But I mean, we tend to compartmentalise these issues. But we may come on to the fact that there are 2.5 million people that are going to face a universal credit cut of £1,000 a year.
It's funny
so why do we think?
It's funny you say that because that is our next question.
Well, it's funny. So why do we think that? I mean, hostile. I think it was Tony Benn that said that, if you want to see how your government would treat you if it could get away with it, look at how they treat migrants and those who come to this country. And I think
very disappointed you didn't do a Tony Benn impression there. There we go.
No.
A couple of texts and tweets. Stephen London says, typical Labour politician to bring identity politics into the interpreter mess up, never miss an opportunity to set one against the other. It's their USP. Yanoa says, data mismanagement seems to be a trait of this current Conservative government. Lost Home Office records, crime data, emails, and now the military. It just goes on and on. Embarrassing. And Ojay says, there must be symmetry of treatment. The Defence Secretary was praised for positive aspects of the evacuation. He must accept full responsibility and be blamed for any cock-up. So we'll move on to another subject in a moment. I just hinted what it might be. Keep your calls coming. 0345 6060 973. It's 19 minutes past 8.
LBC.
Turn
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
22 minutes past 8. Let me reintroduce my panel if you've just joined us. Clive Lewis is Labour MP for Norwich South. Ben Bradley, Conservative MP for Mansfield. Iain Dunt is a columnist on the iPaper. And Juliet Samuel is a columnist on the Telegraph. Now we have a text question from John in Sheffield who says, any chance the Tory, brackets nasty party, brackets government, will reconsider the decision to remove the £20 uplift to universal credit for the sake of families struggling to make ends meet? Ben Bradley, let's come to you first on this. You represent a part of the country where levelling up is a phrase that the government likes to use all the time. How can it possibly be levelling up to cut universal credit for people who will be facing a bit of a cost of living crisis, it seems, in the future?
I'm still trying to work out what angle that particular caller is coming from. I can't work out what his politics might be. Look, I think there's two things here, aren't there? There's been an awful lot of support, 400 billion odd quid over the last 18 months or so, to support people's incomes, to support the cost of living, to support businesses, to keep people employed. It is not true or correct to say that government isn't doing anything to support people on low incomes or vulnerable people. We've introduced living wage, we've reduced the amount of tax people pay. There is a lot of things we can point to for my constituents that says we put more money in your pocket. I think the universal credit challenge in particular is an interesting one, because just like the furlough scheme, just like business grants through COVID, it was always intended as a temporary COVID measure, and just like the furlough scheme is now ending, this is also ending. But when you look at...
But there is a difference, isn't there? Because when it was introduced back in whenever it was, March or April 2020, no one knew that inflation would be going up. It's 3.2%, probably going up to 4%. Wage rises are going up, but probably won't keep pace with that for very long. There is an energy crisis. Fuel bills are going to go up in the winter. It would have been quite understandable for the government to say, look, we did say this was temporary, but we recognise that for a lot of people, times are going to be hard over the next few months. So we may not do it permanently, but we're going to extend it for another 6 months. I think everybody would have understood that.
It's very arbitrary, though, isn't it? Would it not be better for government to come back in the spending review in a few weeks and say, here are some interventions that we're making for those reasons? Obviously, the energy one is a very pertinent one. Why not look at that actually as an issue and see what the right approach to that is, rather than doing something very arbitrary and generic? In truth, whether you look at people who are unemployed on universal credit, where actually as a result of that uplift they've been better off over the last 12 months financially, or whether you look at people who are working and on universal credit, where in addition to that uplift we've also, as I say, we've had furlough, we've had all sorts of measures, hundreds of billions of pounds of measures to keep them in work and keep them employed. It's simply not right to say that we haven't stood by those people on low incomes. That's just not true. And we're now in a place where we're coming out of that pandemic scenario. We're planning for the future. We're rolling out more programmes, Plan for Jobs, Kickstart, Restart, all these programmes to get people into work, record numbers of vacancies. And we will still, I have no doubt, come back in the budget in a few weeks and say, what more can we do to help people who are going to struggle this winter? But it's right that we plan that properly.
Juliet?
I think that I think you make a good case for the for now being a really bad time to remove this, and with furlough and with the other schemes, they were all removed gradually, whereas this is a cliff edge stop to this temporary relief. So I can see the argument for continuing with it for longer, or to see what happens with wages, what happens with the cost of living, inflation, and gas. But I do think that there has to be a point where you say, at what point does the government stop subsidising low pay in this country, which is effectively what it's doing? And at what point do we stop saying, well, if jobs aren't paying enough for people to live, then the government will step in and pay them instead? Because I think that you get into a sort of self-reinforcing cycle where effectively that you remove a lot of pressure to put wages up when you start to distort to a huge degree the market for jobs and the market for wages. So I think that there's a tendency for this argument to only ever go one way. As soon as something is spent, it can't possibly be taken away. But I think you have to look at the situation, which is why I would see the argument for extending it now, given what's going on with cost of living. But I don't think that you should just arbitrarily throw sort of temporary relief and make it permanent every single time.
Iain Dale, that's a good point that Juliet made about effectively the benefit system or tax credits subsidising exploitative employers.
Yeah, the thing is, look, there's a bunch of stuff that we don't know, and there's a bunch of stuff that we do know. We don't know, for instance, how long inflation is going to go on for. There's some people that say that it's about to spiral out of control over the next few years. There's some people that say it might be over quite shortly. However, what we do know is this. There's no one suggesting that inflation is going to go away over the winter. There's no one talking about it going away over the next few months. Now, the kind of inflation that we're seeing right now, you look at energy. I mean, energy is like the most diabolical of all price rises because it just does no good for anyone. It makes all of us poorer. We all pay more for goods. And it spreads out across the economy, whether it's meat or anything else. You look at the labour shortages, and again, even where wages go up there, we're still expecting that will drive up inflation in very many areas without helping the people who are not in those jobs. Now, that we do know. We do know what the situation is over the winter. And in that context, I just think you have to be, I don't want to put it too harshly, but you have to be pretty cruel and thoughtless that you're going to take away 20 quid a week from the poorest people in that context. That is deeply irresponsible.
What do you say to the argument that, well, it's cost £5 billion, where's that going to come from?
I mean, where does any of our money come from? I mean, we're raising taxes right now. We borrow on the bond market at historically low interest rates. We have the capacity to do that right now with a considerable degree of confidence on the international bond markets. I mean, that is simply the way that we operate. We're already spending that money at the moment. We choose not to do it for this period. That is a choice. It's not a question of having to cut off spending in some other area.
Clive?
Well, I mean, let's be really clear, and I've said this before, I'll say it again, the £400 billion we owe to ourselves. It's the Bank of England that's created that £400 billion. We are the sovereign owners, the people, the government of the Bank of England. I think they'll be quite generous on their repayment terms in terms of the timing of that £400 billion being paid back because we're paying ourselves back. The Bank of England created that money. We own the Bank of England. So I think in terms of the decision, the political decision, not the economic decision, the political decision, I agree with Iain, to take that money back now from some of the poorest and most vulnerable people, which is the biggest overnight cut to social security since the Second World War, is deeply irresponsible and quite frankly callous.
Does it count as a cut when it was only ever meant?
So I think the problem is, Ian Duncan Smith, the architect of Universal Credit, walked away from the scheme because it was so badly funded in the first place. So, I mean, we start from a position where Universal Credit wasn't fit for purpose. And he chief designer said that.
An amendment yesterday to reverse the decision.
Because I think he probably has a pretty good understanding. He had his kind of eureka moment on television when he kind of saw how people were living. And look, I'm not here to make any comment on Ian Duncan Smith, but Ian Duncan Smith was the key architect of Universal Credit, and he walked away from it because he understood that it was a victim of George Osborne's Treasury politicking and austerity, which he wasn't prepared to stand by. So Universal Credit was already flawed. But I want to pick up on Juliet's point about the fact that the government is subsidising low pay. I agree with her. But there's something that's dominated politics and economics for the last kind of 30 or 40 years, and that's labour market flexibility. And that's this notion that you need to strip away people's trade union rights because that will keep the labour market flexible, take away their terms, reduce their terms and conditions, reduce their trade union rights, and that makes the labour market more flexible. And that means that employers can get a better price and keep prices down.
Trade union law hasn't changed in the last 20, 30 years.
And it was one of, I think, the last Labour government's biggest failings in terms of not undoing that and giving people the ability through their trade unions to demand better terms and conditions and pay. And consequently, what you have now, you have a buyer's market where the employer basically can suppress wages because unions are so weak and labour is so weak. So I agree. We do have a situation whereby the jobs market is, we've got EU migrants who are now out of the country. Many of them have left. We're coming out the back of COVID. There are areas where there is large wage price inflation.
Just to correct you on that, because I know that's the narrative that everybody likes to promulgate, but actually there are more EU citizens in this country than there were in 2016 or even in 2019.
I guess it's where they're working and where you've got those supplies at the moment. And whilst there may be more people in, there are obviously some people who have left because of, for want of a better term.
Well, there's always been churn, hasn't there?
So there are areas, and I think it's clear to say, whilst there is wage price inflation in some employment sectors, there are others where that isn't happening, where we know that fire and rehire terms and conditions are being suppressed. So it's a very mixed picture. But I think, to take this money away now is fundamentally wrong. It is a political choice. We do have more time. The OECD has warned, I think, today against governments cutting back on their COVID support. It needs to be in place for longer because I think many economists, not all, but many economists understand that the conditions are not right to start pulling money out of the economy, when actually we learned during austerity that's not always the best idea when the economy is shrinking on the private sector, in the private side.
Right, we'll move on to another question in just a couple of minutes' time. In the meantime, keep your calls coming 0345 6060 973. It's 8:32. David Dom has the LBC News headlines.
The food industry has welcomed a deal to restart carbon dioxide production in the UK. The government reached an agreement after production halted due to rising wholesale gas prices last week. Boris Johnson has arrived in Washington ahead of his meeting with Joe Biden. The US president has pledged more than $11 billion per year to help developing nations tackle climate change. A third Russian spy has been charged over the Salisbury poisonings. A woman died in 2018 and 3 people were left seriously ill. LBC weather, mostly dry tonight with some blustery rain in northern Scotland and a low of 10 degrees.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
8:36. You know me, I always like to admit when I'm wrong. Well, Karen has found something that I've just said which was wrong, and he's right, or she's right. You were wrong about decades since changes to trade union law. There was the Trade Union Act 2010, which made big changes, particularly for public sector workers. You're absolutely right. I can't remember the detail of it. I'm sure you can.
I was wrong not to pick you up on that.
You were very wrong. Surprisingly. But there we are. Let's move on quickly. Dean in Swansea, you've got a question for us. Hi.
Yeah, hi. The motorway protesters that have basically been causing mayhem for the past 3 weeks tried to send a letter to the government, basically to try and hold them to ransom, in my opinion. If they are found to be persistently offending and returning back to the scene after they've been charged, is it a way of getting their bank accounts frozen for 3 months just to try and deter this?
Well, it's a thought. It would probably be illegal to do it, but it's a thought. I mean, we've all got views on the right and wrong way to protest, but looking at some of the pictures today, I was looking at one on the LBC website earlier where people were crossing the motorway on both sides on the M25 today. You think, in the end, somebody's going to get killed here. That is almost inevitably going to happen if they keep doing this, particularly in the way that they were doing it today. So, I mean, we can address the freezing the bank accounts issue if you like, but how can these protests be deterred? Should they be? And what do you think the government's reaction to these protests should entail? Iain?
I mean, the first thing to do is to make sure that everybody's safe. So the police have two roles in these scenarios. You're protecting public order. You're also trying to facilitate protests. Now, over last week, we saw lots of calls, especially, towards the Home Secretary, saying the police have got to toughen up. Lots of complaints that the police have suddenly gone woke. One of those words that as soon as it's uttered, you know that your brain is about to melt inside of your skull. The truth is, police on the ground make that operational decision. We're trying to make sure people are safe. We're trying to make sure they can protest properly. And these are the people that should be making the decisions. You have the laws to deal with this. You have the Public Order Act. You have several others. They're all there to be used. And the police make the call. Because if you just rightly pointed out, the situation's really, really dangerous. And they're the ones who should be making the call rather than the Home Secretary or any of the rather frothing at the mouth columnists who've been doing it in recent days.
That's enough about Juliet and me.
Oh no! Have you written a piece like that?
No, Juliet.
I think that's slightly. That supposes that policing takes place in a political vacuum, which it doesn't. And we've seen over the last few years that it's in fact intensely political. Some protests get shut down very quickly, and some are allowed to continue for weeks and weeks. And I think that. The approach to sort of chat with the protesters and let them sit there on the motorway for hours and hours was clearly the wrong one. It is clearly unacceptable for this country to have, the main arteries of trade and emergency services and people going to work and people going to visit their relations to have that shut down for hours and hours. I mean, if a foreign state does that or a political group does that, we would call it an act of war or an act of terrorism. And this really affects people's lives, and it cannot be allowed to continue. And I don't have any respect for people who, because they feel so passionately about this, then it's just fine. They should get on with it. I mean, these people have a martyr complex. They know that what they're doing is dangerous, and that's probably part of the appeal of it to them. And I know people who are just as passionate as they are about climate change and about these issues. And I have a friend who, when she was a student, she really wanted to chain herself to buildings and to occupy things and what she to do with climate change because she was worried about that issue. And what she's now doing as a grown-up person is working as an advisor to investment funds, telling them how they can invest their money to alleviate climate change. And one of the things they want to do is to retrofit buildings and insulate Britain, as these protesters want to do. That, to me, is an honourable and effective way to act passionately on an issue you care about, not to sit in the middle of a motorway until someone gets killed.
Clive?
I have a slightly different take on that. I think the right to protest is a fundamental democratic right in this country. It's clearly, look, we've just had the police and crime and sentencing bill, which is one of the most draconian pieces of policing, was one of the most draconian policing bills that I think we've seen in a number of years. And, it puts in question, I think, some fundamental democratic principles in this country about who has the right to protest and how we protest. And that increasingly, as you have already said, is increasingly politicised. It's not outsourced simply to the police, although the police can make decisions, political decisions, about whether a picket line can take place or not. And I think that's fundamentally wrong. So on the climate crisis, I think we have to acknowledge why these people are causing this disruption. Protest, by its very name, is about disruption. Okay, and I think I was just looking up then the suffragette that jumped in front of the King's horse. I'm sure there were thousands of Emily Pankhurst. I'm sure there were thousands.
Emily Wilding Davison.
Emily Wilding Davis. Thank you. I'm sure there were thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who were outraged at what she did, and yet through the lens of history, there would be many people, some maybe on this table, who would think that actually her cause was right in what she was doing in the interest of the democratic freedoms and rights of women in this country. And yet, future generations may well look at what climate protests are doing. Yes, they are inconveniencing us, and I accept that. But actually, when you look at the existential threat that confronts us and the lack of action that this government and other governments, it's not just this government, but other governments are taking. Scientists just worked out this week or the last couple of weeks that we're now on course for 2.7 degrees of warming in the next 10 to 15 years. 2.7. Runaway climate change takes place at 1.5 degrees centigrade. So I kind of understand it's inconvenient. And if I was caught on the M25, and it's entirely possible that I could be, I'm sure I'd be frustrated. But I would also understand why it's happening, because these people are trying to use their democratic voice to highlight an existential threat that is facing us in a government that isn't taking the appropriate action.
It's different forms of protest. I mean, the only protest that I can remember going on was actually at UEA back in 2004 when they were closing this language school where I got my degree.
I remember that.
And I thought this was outrageous that future generations would not be able to have the kind of education that I had. And I went and spoke at this protest. Now, there was no sit-in or anything, and it was all very sort of calm and, as you might expect, I think it'd been 20 years earlier at UEA, it wouldn't have been so calm. But of course, it didn't make any difference at all, and they still went ahead with it. Had we chained ourselves to railings, I mean, I'm not sure it would have made any difference at all. Ben Bradley, have you ever been on a protest?
No. I like to try and do things and change things rather than moan about things. I think I fundamentally disagree with Clive. It's not just a case of inconvenience, is it? I listened to the Nick Ferrari interview yesterday where he was interviewing the chap who was trying to defend the fact that protest had left a woman paralysed. And we've all been sat here in Westminster where Extinction Rebellion have clogged up the place and ambulances haven't been able to get to St Thomas's. It's not just about inconvenience, it's literally putting lives at risk, particularly running across the motorway in front of traffic. I think they want locking up, frankly, and I hope that somebody who was involved in that protest where that woman was paralysed gets sued, because they should be. We can all talk about the climate crisis. We all want to be more green, we all want to be more environmentally friendly. Maybe government should do more. We've got COP coming down the road. I'm sure there will be announcements and there'll be things that will happen. Lots of people say it's not enough, but that's a global issue that affects governments across the world. We're a small part of that, in truth. What Nick said yesterday was absolutely right. Those people have a direct impact on the day-to-day lives of people and on a woman's life in that particular scenario. For right to protest, yes, but nobody has a right to impact on the lives of others in that way. It's just fundamentally wrong. And no matter what, whether it's clogging up workplaces or here in London, bringing London to a standstill, or whether it's stopping people going about their business, getting to work, nobody has a right to do that in my eyes. I think the Police and Crime Bill is exactly the right thing to make sure that people can't just on a whim or off their own kind of middle-class pretentiousness, frankly, go out there and think they can just have that impact on everybody. I can sense you
bristling, Iain Dunt.
Yes, there was a lot that was wrong there and profoundly irritating. The first thing is the idea of being this middle-class thing. I mean, actually, protest is usually the voice of the people who are most marginalised, who most struggle to make themselves heard. When you can just do it in a newspaper, you kind of don't really need to go on a protest anymore. When you can't find any other way of making yourself heard, that's when you have to take to the streets and you demonstrate. The key is in the word, you demonstrate your argument. It's one of the most pivotal kinds of free speech for that. And it says to others, this is the message that we care and that you want you to join us. Now, what is Priti Patel's response to that? It is to literally silence them, to say that if one person might potentially be alarmed by the noise that they hear, that protest can be silenced. Now, I'm sorry. That is the text. That is the text of the bill. There's no point having a debate over what is objectively true. That is in the text of the bill. That is in the provisions of the bill itself. I'm almost reading it word for word. Now, on that basis, that is the silencing of protest. It is not what any confident, liberal, free society would do, and it's shameful that it's happening in ours.
But should 80 or 90 people, and this is all around the M25, not just at one junction. I mean, often there's 10 or 15 that bring the motorway to a halt. You have to say, in terms of protesting methods, I mean, it's been quite successful in that they've managed it with comparatively few people. This isn't a march with 100,000 people or 1 million people. This is a very small amount of people doing, some would say, disproportionate damage to the well, not just the economy, but to people's lives.
Yeah, so look, this is my view. If you're a protester, you should think long and hard about whether you're going to attract more people to your cause by the manner in which you're pursuing it, or whether you're going to alienate more people. And my hunch is that in this case, they're going to end up alienating more people than they attract.
But also, these people are not voiceless. The things that they're asking for are government policy. The government policy hasn't worked very well. The government's tried various different things to incentivise people to retrofit their homes, they've tried different financing schemes, and yet they're not working very well. But it's not as if this is some kind of revolutionary new thing that they're completely voiceless and no one's ever heard this before, and the government completely is going in the opposite direction. Actually, most of us pretty much agree that we shouldn't have energy leaking out of our homes. The question is this detailed policy question as to exactly how you do that in the most cost-effective way. And I don't think we're having that debate when people are sitting on the M25.
Thank you very much indeed. We'll move on to another very serious issue in a couple of minutes' time. It's 8:47.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player.
It's not always been that special.
UK is going to be in the back of the queue.
But at its best, it's been one of the most enduring alliances on the planet.
Here is the enduring greatness of the British contribution to mankind, the great civilized ideas.
So, as Prime Minister Boris Johnson and President Joe Biden get together in the White House for a summit for the first time, is it the dawn of a new era for the transatlantic friendship?
Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
With the British Airways American Express Accelerating Business Card. Check out the world.
LBC.
Has your
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
8:51 on LBC. Let's move on to our next caller. It's a text from Mary in Withensea. No idea where that is. Given today's news about the Salisbury attack and Litvinenko, does the West need to do more to tackle Russia? Ben Bradley.
Thanks for that, because I told you before this show that if this came up, I've got no idea what I'm on about.
I actually didn't do that on purpose. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
No, look,
honestly, I love that.
Yeah, I said I'd bring it round to Vigil on the BBC and nuclear submarines and see if I could talk about Saran Jones instead, which I won't do for the record. But
no. Stop padding.
In 2 minutes. Look, it's hugely challenging, isn't it? I think we're not in a position. I don't think any of this is new news, is it? We're going back over old ground, really.
Well, it is new in that they found a third person partly responsible for the Salisbury attack. So from that point of view, it is. And the fact that the European Court of Human Rights have found Russia guilty of Litvinenko, I think, we all know that Russia was behind that. But the question is, how do our relations change with Russia beyond that which they already have?
On the global scale, it's really challenging to know what you can do, isn't it? Clearly, I mean, perhaps if there are more people involved, it points to a bigger challenge here in the UK. And clearly there's a lot of kind of work within the MOD Home Office to try and make sure we have found the full extent of that in terms of picking it out of our society. But actually on a global scale, we look at Russia, we look at China and the challenges that we face internationally, unless you're genuinely willing to apply meaningful sanctions and stop those relationships in terms of trade, in terms of finance, then seemingly there's very little impact you can really have, I think, in some of these relationships. And we've never been really willing to do that up to now.
Clive Lewis.
I think in terms of Russia, I think it's quite clear. I mean, I think I always have to state before I open my mouth on it is that, Putin is a despicable politician and leader of his country, a liar, brutal and anti-democratic. The regime that has basically become now on his watch begun to dominate Russia. But you know what? I also think when you look at the world, you look at our involvement. I so often think I see the world in shades of grey rather than black and white. And I think too often in foreign policy, clearly what the Russians did, murdering someone here in the UK with an awful poison, with awful poisons and all that happened, there's been a track record of it in this country. It's clearly wrong. But I think when you look globally at China, you look at the war on terror and the millions dead, you look at what's happened around the world, it's quite clear that we are dealing with shades of grey. And I think one of the things I would like to see as we move into the 21st century with an existential threat confronting us is how do we begin to move away from this kind of post-Cold War increasing securitization. But what I mean by that is this kind of constant arms race, that the only way that you can deliver peace in the world, the only way that you can see a better world is through a constant arms race, a constant securitization race, a constant race of secret services confronting each other, special forces, drones. At what point do we stop and understand that you can't confront the climate crisis in this way? You can't confront ideas in this way. There has to be a better way than simply arming ourselves to the teeth and saber rattling. And if you look at what's happening with China, if you look at what's happening around the world is becoming an increasingly unstable, unfriendly, and frankly dangerous place. That's not just my thoughts. Those are the thoughts of those who are the kind of the UN General Secretary and others. We are taking the wrong step back into the abyss, I think he said today or yesterday. So I think, if you look at the world, it's a deeply unstable place. Clearly, I'm sure the UK will hold Russia to account on this. Russia has done wrong. But I think when you see it in the context of global security, we're in a deeply dark and bad place. And I wonder how we get out of it.
How is it, Juliet, that we allow a Russian propaganda channel to operate in our country?
Well, because we have free speech, which they don't have in Russia.
That there are limits to that.
Yes, there are. And in fact, the Chinese government discovered the limits of that because their station was taken offline because it was found to be a mouthpiece for the Chinese Communist Party, which breaks Ofcom rules. But I think it's slightly bizarre that we started with Salisbury and Litvinenko and then we wound up in grey areas and climate change, because frankly, there was no grey area with the Salisbury attack with Litvinenko. A foreign state mounted a chemical attack on British soil, and I think that one thing that's quite interesting to compare the two incidents is when Litvinenko happened, then essentially nothing happened after that. We knew it was Russia because you could trace the polonium across Europe, going all the way back to Russia, and that they made no effort to disguise it. But nothing really happened after that. After Salisbury, this government did actually mobilise diplomatically in order to expel diplomats, in order to impose a cost. And then you also had then the US imposing sanctions on various Russian companies that would seem to be linked to Putin.
That was probably Boris Johnson's finest hour.
It was, yeah, it was.
Not a lot of competition for that accolade.
No, admittedly, no. But something happened. The whole world could see that this was a shameful thing, that this was effectively an act of war, and that we weren't going to go to war about it, but we weren't just going to sit there. And I don't think you can. I think the lesson from this is that when things like this happen, whether it's that which is more blatant, or whether it's cyber attacks, or whether it's our universities being told by the Russian ambassador that they can't have dissidents to come and speak, or whether it's propaganda channels broadcasting, there has to be a cost to that. There has to be sanctions, there has to be diplomats expelled, there have to be defense pacts created. For example, if you're militarizing huge sections of the Pacific and building airstrips on shoals in the sea, then yes, the countries around there might get worried and start trying to build submarines. There has to be a response. Okay. If you just sit there, then these things continue.
Iain Dunt.
Yeah, I agree entirely. You can't just allow Russia to murder people on our soil. And I don't think there's any world in which we should convince ourselves that when it comes to Russia or when it comes to China, that we can just sit back and they will sit in their own territory and not interfere. They will not do that. That's why you strengthen especially the countries around them, and especially, by the way, more than anywhere, Ukraine, which deserves our help, I think, more than any country on earth. That's why you strengthen against China Indo-Pacific countries in a way that's being done, although apparently for reasons that I will never understand, in a way that needs to humiliate and exclude the French, a major power in that area. You take the fight to the point where you discourage their action. And that, if there is a path for peace with China and with Russia, it is to make sure that you make very, very clear to them what the consequences are of these kinds of actions. And hopefully we'll be seeing more of that towards Russia and towards China from both our government and from the United States.
No, that's absolutely right. And it goes back to Clive's point. It's not about who's got the biggest guns. It's strategic. It's about who are our partners, who are our allies in this conversation. The idea that you could go, right, well, we'll put down all of our defence packs and nuclear weapons and we'll bin Trident, we'll do all that if China, you'll just agree very kindly to stop putting Muslims in education camps, is for the birds, isn't it? It's not going to happen. And unless I
guess the point I want to kind of put across is I'm not in disagreement with most of what's been said here in terms of the response to what China or Russia have done when they have overstepped the mark, overstepped the line, murdered people, chemical attacks. I understand that, but I guess at what point, given what we know is coming in the 21st century with failing states, food insecurity, energy insecurity, potential runaway climate change. When you look at COVID vaccine apartheid, we're looking at booster shots here, and less than 5% of the world, the poorest people on the planet, have been vaccinated. It was called vaccine apartheid by the Director General of the World Health Organization this week. You look at those instabilities, those global instabilities that are now becoming ever and ever more prevalent, and then you look at now, we're building nuclear submarines in the Pacific with Australia. I understand what people are saying about having a security response, but at what point do we begin to work out how we get over the international strategic problems which are confronting all of humanity, and understand that unless we actually do something which moves beyond just building more weapons and securitizing, that we will end up in a very dark and bad place if we aren't there already.
Final text question, which is the most challenging question you'll have had on the programme today, Ben. Gladys in Aberdeen says the government has reached a deal on CO2, so iron brew may no longer be under threat. What's your favourite fizzy drink? And while you will think about that answer, I'm going to tell you who's on tomorrow night on Cross Question. We have Alex Salmond with us, Simon Marks, our US correspondent, Charlotte Proudman, and the Conservative MP, Joy Morrissey. Juliet.
Gin and tonic.
It's not a fizzy drink.
Good choice.
It's fizzy.
A little bit. Clive.
Buckfast.
Pardon?
Buckfast.
After what?
You don't know. I'm joking. It's like a kind of. Do you know what Buckfast is?
Is that an offer or a threat?
It's made by Scottish. It's made by Scottish monks. It's basically, someone described it as a combination. I chased it a bit. It's a combination of special brew, Red Bull, and it's got something else in it. But it's very fizzy. It's fizzy and it's
got to be different.
I would say sparkling water. I love sparkling water.
All right.
I don't have to think about it for a second. I have a very healthy Diet Coke addiction, I'm afraid. 3 cans a day. It's not good for you, is it?
No, it isn't.
wow.
Ian?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm Metropolitan Liberal Elite, so it's obviously champagne.
Sadly, we haven't got any in the studio. Obviously, the correct answer to Gladys's question is lilt.
No one says lilt.
I love lilt.
Hasn't it moved on now from lilt?
No, lilt you can still get, but they've changed the colour of the bottle, which I think is a bit annoying. But anyway, right, thank you very much indeed to all of you. Clive Lewis, Juliet Samuel, Ben Bradley, Iain Dunt. Cross Question back tomorrow at 8. If you missed any of this, you can catch it up on the Cross Question podcast, or it's available on YouTube right now. In a moment, we're going to be talking about why only 20% of people are still wearing masks on public transport. Are you one of them? 0345 6060 973. It's 2 minutes past 9.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, the government has reached a deal to restart the production of carbon dioxide in the UK amid warnings of food shortages. US firm CF Industries halted its operations last week due to rising wholesale gas prices. CO2 is used widely in the food supply chain, including for meat packaging and to ensure longer shelf lives. Patrick Holden from